Welcome to the Verbatik Media Revision Workshop series. This session was conducted live on Zoom as part of our free educational initiative designed to help writers understand the craft, structure, and revision process behind strong manuscripts. Please note that this is a live workshop recording, so there may be moments of audience interaction, pauses, and live discussion throughout the session. If you find this workshop valuable, do consider subscribing to the channel and exploring Verbatik Media for manuscript assessments, professional editing, publishing consultancy, and future workshops. You'll also find links to our writing community, resources, and upcoming sessions in the description below. Now let's begin. I'm a creative writing coach. I coach writers in writing their manuscripts. I also coach them in finishing their manuscript. And I'm also a ghostwriter, so I also write books for my clients. I am a publishing consultant. Being in the industry for so long has helped me gain incredible insight into how the process works, especially in India. Then I'm the founder of Verbatik Media. I founded Verbatik 2 years ago. My main aim of having founded Verbatik Media is to help authors fulfill their dream of becoming authors and not just publish books, but publish good books that look like proper traditional books. I'm also the founder of The Reading Bud. It is a book blog that I started almost 12 years now. This is the 13th year running of The Reading Bud. I'm a cat mom. I'm also a cat rescuer. I love psychology. I studied psychology from Yale, and I've studied ancient literature, ancient masterpieces of world literature, as well as modern masterpieces of world literature from Harvard. And I'm a philosophy aficionado. I've recently started dipping toes in philosophy as well. So these are the subjects of my interest. The two books that I've published so far are one is Deceived and one is The Manor. Deceived is a psychological thriller. The Manor is a gothic horror novella. You can find details about them on my website, on Verbatik Media's website, and on Amazon. So I won't be taking too much time talking about it. This is The Art of Storytelling. It is a book on writing and finishing the book. And also it contains details about how to publish book in India. It covers a lot of topics. I also share a couple of systems and frameworks that I have developed because I'm a self-taught writer. So I've developed a lot of systems and frameworks, and those I've shared in this. This book is going to be released hopefully in August this year. We are experiencing some delay in the release of this book because I'm waiting for a couple of tie-ups that I really want to go through before I publish this book. So hopefully it's going to be in August 2026. You can pre-order this book via Verbatik Media's website. So let's get on with the workshop. Diagnosing your manuscript and building a revision plan. So we'll be going section by section. Let me just give you an idea of what all we'll be covering today. Why most writers struggle with revisions. Second, what revision actually is. Third, the 5-layer manuscript diagnosis framework. Fourth, how to revise the scene and chapter system. Fifth will be the live scene revision demo. And that's going to be sixth, building a revision plan. So these are the sections that I'll be covering. After I finish one section, if you guys have doubts, you can leave it in the comments because I'll be reading all the comments at the end of the workshop because I would not like to keep everyone waiting. Section 1, why most writers struggle after draft 1. Now, before we get into how to revise your manuscript, I want to start with one basic fundamental truth. Most writers don't struggle because they can't write. They struggle because they don't know how to look at their own work objectively after they have written it. And that's where everything begins to fall apart. Now, here's what typically happens after draft 1. You finish writing your manuscript and there's a mix of emotions. You're excited, you're feeling relieved, you're also slightly terrified. So, what do most writers do? They open their document, they scroll back to page 1 and start fixing sentences. They tweak a line here, change a word there, maybe rewrite a paragraph, or maybe they work on some dialogues. And if they are feeling particularly productive that day, then they end up editing, say, 3 to 5 pages. And for a while, it actually feels like progress. But in reality, that is not progress, because what you are doing in that moment is not revision. It's quite literally a voice that is disguised as productivity. And that is very dangerous. Now, and I say this with full empathy because I've seen this pattern for over a decade now. Writers spend weeks, months, and even sometimes years editing their manuscripts, only to realize that something still feels off. They can't quite explain it. They feel like the story isn't landing the way they wanted to, or maybe the middle feels heavy, or the characters feel slightly flat. But they've already edited or revised it multiple times. So now they're stuck. Now, this is where the actual problem begins, because you are approaching the entire process of revision emotionally and not structurally. Now, when you revise emotionally, you fix what bothers you. As a writer, you focus on what feels wrong in the moment and you chase sentences instead of solving the story related problems first. When you revise structurally, you take a step back, you look at the entire picture. There's a very famous saying which goes like, you shouldn't be looking at the trees, you should be looking at the forest as well as the trees, right? So that's what we are going to be doing in structural revision. We'll take a step back. We are going to diagnose the manuscript as a system, and then we are going to identify what is actually not working in the manuscript. And that shift from emotional to structural revision is what we are going to build today. Because right now, most of you are looking at your manuscripts like this. You're inside it, you're too close to it, you're too attached to maybe some specific scenes, specific lines, and specific moments. And because of that, you're unable to see the actual shape of the story as a reader. And if you cannot see the shape of your story, you cannot fix it. So before we talk about revision techniques, tools, or exercises, or anything, we need to first fix the way you are looking at your manuscript. Because this is the single most important thing I want you to carry with you from today's session. You cannot fix what you cannot see clearly. And today's session is going to give you that clarity and also a system, a way to look at your manuscript and say, okay, this is not working, this is working, and this is what I need to do next. So now let's get very clear on what revision actually is, because most writers are getting that wrong too. Most writers don't actually understand what revision is. They think they do, but what they're actually doing is editing. And it's not even proper editing, it's just their idea of editing. Now, let us separate this very clearly, because if you don't get this distinction right, everything else in the workshop won't work for you. Just one second. I'm sorry, I have very bad allergies and they get worse in summers. So I might be occasionally taking break for coughing. So I'm very sorry about that. Okay, so let us get this right. What is editing and what is revision? Editing is mostly sentence level unless it is developmental editing. Now, there's a very big difference in developmental editing and substantive editing. When writers usually refer to editing, they are mostly talking about substantive editing and not developmental editing is something that I have an expertise in. I perform developmental editing on almost all my projects. So right now, when I say editing, I'm not exactly talking about developmental editing because it is an entirely different thing. Okay. So when I say editing right now, it means substantive editing, which is line by line editing. So for writers, editing would be fixing grammar, improving phrasing, tightening paragraphs, and making the writing sound
better. And of course, editing is important because it is going to refine your prose. And also, it's going to tackle a lot of issues, especially if it is developmental editing. But the thing is, editing is something that is done at the end, at the very end. It is done after the revisions are completed properly by the author. It is not something that the author does while revising a book. Now, this is the most common problem that writers face because they do not know the distinction, and they in their head think that they are editing the book, and because of that they approach the revisions in the wrong way, and they end up making their manuscripts worse than what it was before the revisions. Now, how revision is different from editing? In revision we go structurally. In revision, it is not about how your sentences sound. It is about whether a scene is working or not. And if it is not working, you need to take that scene off. Whether a character is working or not, whether it is completely developed or not, whether it needs more backstory, whether it needs more conflict. There are like 1,000 things that you need to work on during revision. And these are the things that substantive editing does not cover. That is why you, as the author, have to work on this, on developing the book properly while working on the revisions. Another thing is you need to see if the story is actually moving forward and actually moving in the direction that you want it to go in. All this is done in revision. So this is how editing is different from revisions. Now, most of the time when the writer says, I'm revising my manuscript, what they are actually doing is they're rewriting sentences. They're changing the descriptions again. And maybe they're adjusting the dialogues. That is not revision. That is not you revising. You are performing a surface level edit while doing all this. And the problem with that is you are sabotaging your own manuscript because when you start editing too early, you might make the prose a little better. You can polish the language, and maybe you feel that your writing sounds better now, but the story underneath is still weak. So there's quite literally no point in performing a surface level editing on a manuscript that is not even ready to be edited. So now you are then stuck with something that is maybe well written, okay, and that is also a very rare possibility. But you will definitely have something that is not working on a story level, on a plot level. And that is way harder to work for any editor then, because once you do this mistake and then you hire some editor to make your book better, they are going to have a very hard time in doing so because the manuscript is already over edited from the author's end. Now, and this usually happens because the writer is emotionally attached to the writing. Now, I'm not talking about people who use AI to write their books, because in that case, they're quite literally not even invested in their books. I am talking about writers, proper real writers, who write their books maybe on a notebook or in a Word document, like I do. I write on both. I write on a notebook and I write my books on my MacBook. But if you've written your story by yourself, you're going to be so insanely invested, emotionally invested in it, that it's going to be hard for you to be cutting out stuff that you have maybe spent a lot of time writing. And then you again spend a lot of time polishing it. So cutting it, restructuring it, or changing it will feel painful. But that is why revision has to begin in a very different place. If you feel emotionally attached to something, it might actually be working for the story. You never know. That is why before working on the language or touching any of the sentences, you need to first look at it in 5 layers, which we are going to be discussing in, I think, the next or the next to next session. I think in the next session, right just after this. So again, revision is not let me improve what I've written. Revision is Let me understand what I've written. Okay? And that brings us to the most important shift in the entire process. Revision is understanding the problem first and then correcting it later. You do not start by fixing, you start by observing first. Always. And this is something that 99% of the writers don't do. When you have finished writing your first draft, or maybe your first finished draft is your actually second draft. So when you finish your full manuscript, you are not going to begin revising it. What you are going to do is take a break from it of at least 3 weeks. Do not think about it. Do not read it. Do not tweak it. Do not do anything. Just stay away from it for 3 weeks. Take a break. Stay away from it for 3 weeks. If you can't stay away from it for 3 weeks, try writing something else or try working on some other story. After 3 or 4 weeks, come back to this manuscript and read it first from start to end. Do not go in with the red pen or a black pen or a blue pen or maybe, with the track changes or something. Do not tweak it at all. Just tell yourself you're reading someone else's book and read it like a reader. When you read it like a reader, you are going to pick up on many big picture problems. And that is where you're going to begin your revision. After you're done reading the entire manuscript, you're going to be noting down all the problems that you found in the book, not on sentence level, on the broader level. Okay? I'm going to teach you how, but this is what you're going to do. After you make that list, you're going to go according to that list. Okay? So we go we go outside in, not inside out in revision. Okay? Now, the problem is most writers, after they finish writing their draft, they do not read their manuscripts. They simply open the document again without having taken any break from the project. And now the problem is, it's very difficult to explain, but the problem is it's all sitting in your head right here. You've just finished it. And you go back to it again and you start editing it. And in your head, you think you've said something that is entirely different from what you've actually ended up writing on the page. And that is where most problems lie. So in order to avoid it, that's why I said take a break of at least 3 weeks. Now, if you're going to go into your manuscript right after you finish it, and if you start randomly making changes here and there, what you're going to end up with is over editing, confusion, inconsistent storytelling, and again, that constant feeling that will never leave you actually of I've worked on this so much, but it still doesn't feel right. You will always know it. Trust me. Now, because you are attending the workshop and I'm telling you all this, so from today onwards, I want you to be very conscious of this. Whenever you open your manuscript, ask yourself, what am I doing? Am I just observing the manuscript or reading the manuscript, going through it, trying to figure out what the problem is? Or am I just editing because it feels easier? Because it does. Going inside and changing stuff will placate your ego. It'll make you feel better. It will make you feel very productive. Now, oh my God, I'm working on the revisions of a manuscript. But the problem is, it is not going to help you. In fact, it is only going to destroy your manuscript. So remember, revision is where the real work starts. You cannot be thinking that just because you're done with the first draft or maybe the second draft of your manuscript, your work is over. No, you have to still work on the manuscript, maybe even more than before. Because usually the second and the third drafts take way more energy from a writer than the first draft does. Because writing the first draft is actually one of the easiest things that a writer can do. Okay, so do not make up your mind about, okay, now I've written my manuscript completely, I've gone from point A to point Z, and now I do not have to do anything. No, you have to be prepared to be making very big changes. Okay. Now, once you start rethinking your manuscript properly, you will need a system to guide that thinking. So let's build that system next. Now, this is the system I think that I was talking about earlier. Yes, the 5-layer manuscript diagnosis. I wasn't sure if it was the third section or the fourth section of the manuscript. Okay. So now we talk about the 5-layer manuscript diagnosis. So, how do you actually look at your manuscript in a way that it makes sense to you? Because right now, if I ask you to evaluate your manuscript, most of you will say things like, and this is something that I'm saying from experience because I deal with a lot of writers. In fact, I had 3 meetings today with writers, authors actually. So most of the time I get these answers. Something feels off. This is the patent answer that I get from every writer. Something feels off. Something doesn't add up. Maybe the middle feels weak, and then the writers are like, see, at least I'm able to figure out that the problem is in the middle. But the problem is, middle is a very big space, right? And you need to be able to figure out exactly what is wrong and what issue there is and exactly where in order to sort it out. And there's also the pacing isn't working. Okay, or maybe, I'm not able to build enough tension in the scenes. So at least the last one is still better, but with scenes exactly. See, this is what I'm saying. You cannot be going into revision looking at the entire manuscript like it's this big chunk of text that you need to get through. Okay? I'll just quickly show you a diagram here that I worked out. So this is how usually everyone looks at when they look at their manuscript. But what I want you guys to do is look at it this way. We need to look at what is inside, and we are going to be doing it in 5 layers. 5 proper layers. These layers are core story, characterization, structure and flow, scene purpose, and language and execution. Okay, these are the 5 layers of a manuscript in which we are going to be working on it during revisions. Now, why do we do this? Because we need to find a way to break the manuscript down into parts so we can see exactly where it's working and where it's not. And this is where my 5-layer framework comes into picture. Now, your manuscript is obviously not just one thing. Now, I would just like to pause here for a second. If you guys are still in the process of writing, then I would urge you to go on my YouTube channel, not Verbatik Media's, because the content is still on my YouTube channel. If you want, I can share the links later on. But you need to go on my YouTube channel. There you will find a series of 10 lives that I did on how to write your book. And in that, I've covered almost all the topics that are needed in order to write a book properly. Okay, so in that I've shared a lot of things related to story, characterization, plot structures, scene purpose, etc. So I will be leaving the links. Just go through it, just see if there's any topic that you need to look at. Do watch it because it will help you understand. Maybe because there might be some concepts that you might not get here, you will be able to understand them better once you watch those lives. Okay, so your manuscript, as I was saying, is not just one thing. It is not just a story. It is not just your characters. It is not just the plot. Okay, it is a culmination of every single thing. It's a system made up of multiple layers. And if you try to fix everything at once, you will get overwhelmed. Or worse, you'll fix the wrong thing. So instead, we are going to read your manuscript layer by layer. There are 5 layers I want you to start paying attention to, and every problem in your manuscript will fall into one of these 5 layers. Okay? Layer 1, core story. This is the foundation. Strip everything away: characters, scenes, writing, your pacing, tension, everything, even the conflict for a second. And ask yourself, what is this story actually about? And more importantly, what changes from beginning to end? Because a story is not just a series of events. A story is transformation. Something or someone must shift. If that shift is unclear, it doesn't matter how well written your scenes are, the story will feel empty. So, when you're looking at your manuscript, I want you to ask yourself, what is this really about beneath the surface? And what is different at the end compared to the beginning? If you can't answer these two questions clearly, that's where your revision will begin. Layer number 2, characterization. Now we move one level deeper because stories don't move on their own. Characters move them. Again, I've spoken about characters for almost 2 hours in the live, so you can watch characterization live. I'm not going to be covering these topics again because everything there was on writing I've already covered, and I just concluded that series actually a month back. So I'm not going to be covering those topics again, just in case if you need them, you can go to the YouTube channel and watch them. Stories don't move on their own, characters move them, right? So the question becomes, what is driving your story forward? And that comes down to one thing. What does your protagonist want? And equally important, what are they struggling against? Both externally as well as internally. Because if your character doesn't want anything clearly, isn't facing a meaningful resistance, or isn't internally conflicted, then then your story will feel passive. Again, I've spoken at length about a story that feels passive. Things will happen, but nothing will feel urgent or immediate. And that is when your story feels passive. And when a story starts feeling passive, as a reader, even I do it, I mark the book DNA, that is, did not finish. I just leave the book there because I do not want to be wasting my time on a book that does not know what it wants to do. Okay? So when you are reading your manuscript, ask yourself, what is my character actively trying to achieve? And what is stopping them, both on the outside and within? If that is weak, your entire narrative weakens with it. So that's where you'll be beginning your revisions. Layer number 3, structure and flow. Now we zoom out a little. This is where we look at how the story unfolds over time. Ask yourself, is the story actually moving forward, or is it circling the same emotional or narrative beats again and again? Because this is where most manuscripts completely collapse. Not at the beginning, not at the end. It is always in the middle. Middle is the part where you'll always often see repetition. This is very common, and I always see it. Slow sections that don't add anything new. This is almost always happens. This is also something that almost always happens. Scenes that feel like they're just there. Okay, now this is something that I would like to be talking about in a little while, maybe when we are doing a live demo. I'll explain to you exactly how this happens. And you'll be surprised when you'll be reading your manuscript. And after I tell you this, then you will be able to pick up on this. So here, your job would be to identify, where does the story lose momentum? Where does it stall? And where does it feel like nothing new is happening? Because movement is everything in a story. If the story does not move, the reader will quite literally lose all interest in your story. Now, layer number 4, scene purpose. If we go further, every story is built scene by scene. Now, I think this is a matter of preference, but this is how I write. So I won't be generalizing it, saying most writers write like this. Many do, but I am not speaking about anyone else right now. I'm just talking about how I write. When I think of my story, it always happens even in my mind, and even on the notes I make, or when I start working on the story. It is always scene by scene. Now, I do know writers who like maybe organizing their story in their heads chapter by chapter, but that's not how I function. So, in case if you are one of those people who work on your story chapter by chapter, you will have to pay very close attention to the scene bits. Okay. If you are a writer like me who writes their story scene by scene, then it might actually be easier for you because this is a system designed by me and I am a scene by scene writer. Okay. If you haven't already tried it, try the scene by scene method, because I'm actually used to writing screenplays as well. And this is how we write. Scene by scene is always easier than chapter by chapter. Okay, but again, it's a personal preference. Now, most writers include scenes that don't need to exist. So they write scenes that repeat information or build atmosphere, but don't move anything forward, or maybe have conversations with no consequences. And the last one is the most horrible one. As a reader, I'm talking about as a reader now. So for every single scene, I want you to ask yourself, why does this scene exist? Not, do I like it? Or is it written well? No, you're not going to be asking yourself those questions. You're going to be asking, what is this scene doing in the story? And more importantly, what changes from the beginning of the scene to the end of the scene? Because again, if nothing changes on a scene level, that scene is not doing its job. It's just a filler scene. And in a novel, you do not want filler scenes unless they serve a very particular function. Okay. Now, moving on, there's layer 5, language and execution. This is where most writers start their revision, but where you should actually end it. Okay. This is your writing, your sentences, your voice, your style, the tone of the book. And yes, it matters a lot, but only after you've worked on everything else, the first 4 layers. This will matter only after you've worked on those 4 layers. If you directly go on to this, it will not matter because your story won't feel good. Remember, beautiful writing cannot fix a weak story. So here, you are going to ask yourself, is my writing supporting the story? Or is it trying to compensate for something that isn't working? Because most of the time, writers spend a lot of time beautifying their prose because they know something is wrong with the story. So, we are not going to overcompensate for anything. Instead, we are going to work on every single thing in the first 4 layers and then come to the language and sentences. Okay. Now, obviously, this is going to require a lot of honesty from your end because sometimes what we think is good writing is actually just overcompensation. So, these are the 5 layers, and every time you sit down to revise, you are not randomly editing. You are going to be reading your manuscript now through one of these lenses. And this brings us to the most important principle of all. You always work from top down. You do not start with language, you do not start with sentences, and you do not start with polishing. You start with story, then character, then structure, then scenes, and only then the writing. Because if you start from the bottom, you will spend hours fixing things that may not even survive the revision. What's the use of performing an edit on maybe a scene or two that's simply going to be removed from the manuscript? So now we move on to the next section of today's workshop, how to revise the scene chapter system. Now, most writers still don't know what to do when they actually sit down to revise, and that's okay. But what is not okay is even after learning, not implementing it. Okay? So, what most writers do is they open the document, they scroll, they read a little bit, they fix a line, they jump to another chapter, they get overwhelmed, and they close the document. This is not productive. Okay? And this is coming from someone who has worked on over 100 manuscripts of other authors. Okay? So, trust me, this is not productive. Without a systematic approach, revision will become chaotic and you'll end up giving up. So, what I'm going to give you now is very simple, but it is an extremely powerful way to work through your manuscript. And if you follow this properly, revision will become extremely manageable. Now, if you write scene by scene, this is going to be simpler for you. If you write chapter by chapter, I would implore you to try this method because it might be easier for you to go through your manuscript this way. If this doesn't work out for you, let me know and I'll figure out a way for the chapter by chapter approach. Okay? Now, if you follow this properly, revision will become extremely manageable for you. The rule is very simple. You do not revise the entire manuscript at once. You work through it scene by scene first and then chapter by chapter, because that's how your story is actually built. And so that's how it needs to be fixed. Now, first, you're going to handle scene level revision. So let's start scenes. Now, a scene is the smallest functional unit of a novel. It can be any genre, but a scene is the smallest functional unit. Now, again, I've covered scene in detail. I've also, I think, given an entire framework of how scenes should be, how their cause and effect change should be. So just go through that live and you'll catch up with a lot of good stuff. So every single scene in your manuscript must justify its existence, not emotionally or because you like it, but structurally. Remember, structurally. So when you look at a scene, I want you to slow down and ask very deliberately the following questions. Question number 1. Why does this scene exist? What is its purpose in the story? If you remove this scene, if you remove this scene, what will happen? If your answer is nothing really, then that scene is already in trouble. And what I would suggest is just taking it off completely and then reading the previous and the next scene and then figuring out what you need to put there as a transition. Question number 2 that you need to ask yourself is, what does the character want in this scene? Again, not in the story, only in this particular scene. Because if the character doesn't want something, there will be no drive. And without drive, the scene will just sit there with no purpose at all. Again, you'll have to cut it out or you'll have to add a drive. Now, question number 3. What is the conflict? What is stopping them? What is resisting their want? Conflict doesn't always mean shouting or action. It can be internal, it can be very subtle, but it must exist. Okay? Otherwise, there will be no tension. And without tension, there is quite literally no reason for the reader to stay and read your book. Question number 4. What changes? This is the most important question. By the end of the scene, what is different? Has new information emerged? Has the emotional state shifted? Or has the situation escalated? What's happened? If you reach the end of the scene and everything is exactly the same as it was at the beginning, just like it was in the scene that I sent you all on the WhatsApp group for the exercises, then that scene is not doing its job. You cannot have a static scene will kill the momentum of your story, and you do not want that. Now, I'm just going to digress for a second and just cover this. When a reader enters a book, it doesn't matter what kind of book it is, they always enter a book to be entertained or to learn something or to experience something. And when they enter, there is a willing suspension of disbelief. Now, your book doesn't have to be complete fantasy for the willing suspension of disbelief. It's just that the reader is trusting the author enough to suspend their disbelief in order to believe whatever the author is telling them. Okay? Now, this suspension of disbelief takes only a microsecond to break. And this is why you cannot have a static scene, because if you have a static scene, it is too long for that disbelief to break. And the moment that disbelief breaks, you lose the reader completely. And you do not want that. No one wants that. If I'm your editor, I would never want that for the reader, for you, for the reader to be experiencing that kind of thing in your book. So always remember, you cannot have a static scene unless you have a very good reason to have it. Okay, sorry for the digression, but it was very important. Now we move on to question number 5 in this. What is the outcome or the consequence? What does this scene trigger? What does it lead into? Because scenes are not isolated. They are present to create momentum. They feed into each other. Okay? So when you are revising, you are not reading passively. You are actively interrogating every scene like this. Remember, if nothing changes, It is not a good scene at all. Now, once you start fixing your scenes, we move one level up. That is chapter level revision. So, if you want to go according to my method, there has to be at least readings of your manuscript before you begin revisions. Okay? So, the first time you're going to read your manuscript for revision, it is going to be on a scene by scene level. So, when you're making your notes, it is going to be regarding the scenes. Okay? And now, okay, it might seem that you have to do the entire revision process in 2 times, but it is only till the time you get used to reading a manuscript and picking up on each and every single thing in one reading itself. It will come to you, but it takes practice. Now, here again, what really would help is reading more books. When you're reading novels written by big authors, other authors, best-selling authors, you're reading popular fiction, you're reading popular non-fiction, that is a very good time where you start noticing the pattern of scenes and chapters. It will help you subconsciously prime yourself for your own revisions. Okay? Now, the second reading is going to be chapter by chapter. Okay? So, this is going to be first we finish finding out all the problems on a scene level. And they are going to be completely different from all the problems that you're going to find in the chapter level revision. Okay? Because strong scenes alone are not enough. If they would have been enough, story writing or novel writing wouldn't have been this difficult. You can have beautifully written, structurally sound scenes and still have a very weak chapter. Why? Because a chapter is not just a collection of scenes, it is actually a unit of movement. So now we zoom out and ask ourselves the following questions. Question number 1: what is this chapter doing? Not what happens in this chapter. You already know that, you've already written it. You are going to ask yourself, what is the function of this chapter? Is it advancing the plot? Is it deepening the character? Is it creating tension? Because if it is not doing any of these three, then you need to go back, figure out what is exactly is wrong with the flow of the scenes. Because if there was something wrong with the scenes themselves, you would have noted it in the first reading, right? After you correct them, if the chapter is still not making sense, that means there is a problem in the flow of the scenes. Okay? Now, every chapter must have a job. If it doesn't, it becomes a filler chapter. Question number 2: what changes from start to end? Again, change is everything. Remember, in storytelling, change is everything. Second most important thing is momentum. Okay? So by the end of the chapter, is the situation different? Is the tension higher? Is the reader pulled forward? If the chapter starts and ends at the same emotional or narrative point, it'll give you a flat line on the graph. And we do not want that, because again, that will be a static chapter. Now, question number 3: do the scenes connect logically, or do they just exist next to each other? This is a very common issue actually. Writers write good scenes, but the transitions between them are weak, and the links connecting them are also not strong. So ask yourself, does one scene lead naturally into the next, or do they feel poorly stitched together? Question number 4: does tension escalate? This is very critical. Within the chapter, things should build, even if they build subtly. If tension stays at the same level throughout, the reader will disengage with your writing and your story. Question number 5: does the chapter end strongly? Now, this is where most chapters fail. They just end. Instead of creating curiosity or raising a new question or pushing the story forward, a weak ending breaks the momentum entirely. Again, as I said, movement and momentum are two very important things in storytelling. A strong ending will pull the reader into the next chapter immediately. So remember, a chapter must move the story, not just contain scenes. Now, you need to bring these two approaches together, that is the scene and the level and the chapter level revision. So now let's connect all of this. Scenes create shifts or small changes, moment to moment movement. right? Those shifts combine to create chapter movement, which then builds into the overall story progression. So you see how they're all connected. So if your story is not working, it's usually because your scenes aren't creating meaningful shifts or your chapters aren't organizing those shifts properly. Now let's take all of this and actually see how it plays out in a real example, because this is where things usually click. So I'm going to be sharing my screen again. Just let me see. Okay, I'll have to stop sharing this screen first. Now we are moving to live demonstration. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen. Okay, perfect. So this is the scene. I have taken out actually two scenes that we are going to be looking at now. The first one is a bit obvious, but I really want to cover this because I really want to show you how we can change it, or how we can maybe, just completely remove it, or maybe we can use it as a transition between two scenes. The second one is a bit more complex, and it will give us a very good idea of how a scene can look that it's good, but still serve no purpose. Okay, so let's begin with the first one. I'm going to first read out scene A. Then, sorry. Arav sat on the edge of his bed, staring at his phone as the screen dimmed and lit up again. He had been meaning to call Mira all day, but every time he picked up the phone, something stopped him. He sighed, running a hand through his hair before standing up and pacing the room. The silence around him felt heavier than usual, pressing in on his thoughts. He walked to the window and looked outside. The street was quiet, the occasional car passing by without much noise. It reminded him of how things had been lately, still, uneventful, almost stagnant. He checked his phone again. No new messages. He exhaled slowly and sat back down on the bed, placing the phone beside him this time. Maybe he would call her later. Now, what exactly is happening in the scene? I am opening the chat here in front of me just in case. Okay, so what do you guys think is happening in this scene? How do you feel about it? Do you think it's serving some purpose, or do you think it's written well, or do you think maybe it has a bigger purpose in the story? Whatever it is, please share in the comments. I would love to know. Telling. Indrila said telling. Yes, it is actually too much telling in this scene, right? I agree. Anyone else? Take a guess. It's okay. There's quite literally very few of us here. So it's just okay. Like whatever you feel after having read this scene, now let it all out. Because we quite literally have to diagnose the scene. And that is exactly what I'm trying to tell you, how you can do it. Now, when I first read this scene, it does seem passive. Very good. It does seem passive. More things are moving. Okay, that can be a way to look at it. Yes. Anyone else? Nothing changed in the scene. His dilemma of calling, not calling remains. Exactly. Yes, that is actually the biggest problem with the scene. And obviously, there are other things, right? That is, for example, there is telling, there's a lot of telling. So, but that comes in language. So, we are going to be working on it later on. The first thing that we'll be looking at is it is feeling passive, right? Because if you might have watched that live on scene, you might have, or you might already know about the cause and effect chain, right? So, what is happening here is why this scene feels passive is because nothing is happening majorly and there are no consequences. Even if something's happening, even if Arav is thinking about this girl and the phone and the message, right? He is not doing anything about it. Okay. Now, okay, here I can't see the name, but yes, as someone has rightfully said here, nothing changed in the scene. His dilemma of calling, not calling remains unchanged. That is very true. That is actually the biggest problem, because the scene, as we saw, we are going to be asking ourselves what changed in the scene, and quite literally nothing has changed. Arav is sitting on the bed, maybe he just moved around. He quite literally sits back down. So physically also he is not moving in this scene. And that is like the most horrible kind of scene that you can ever have in a novel. Okay. So if we are if we are revising our manuscript and we've come across a scene like this that we've written, what we are going to do is option one, cut it out. If I'm your editor, I would say completely cut it out. Okay. But because you won't be having a professional editor sitting right there next to you, yelling at you, what you're going to be doing is asking yourself, now what do I do with it? Right? Here's what you're going to do with it. Let me just switch on the track changes so that you can see. Now, if I'm revising this, what I would do is Arav sat on the edge of his bed, staring at his phone on the screen. Okay. He had been meaning to call Mira all day. Okay. Now, in this paragraph, we are at least getting some information. So, in revision, we can retain this. Okay. He had been meaning to call Mira all day, but every time he picked up the phone, something stopped him. He sighed, running a hand through his hair before standing up and pacing the room. Now, this would have made sense had it led to something, but here it is quite literally not leading to anything, so we can completely get rid of this. So we are going to just remove it. Now, he walked to the window and looked outside. The street was quiet, the occasional car passing. Again, it's just too much unnecessary prose. My editing style does not let me keep too much prose unless it is leading to something. And right now, it is quite literally not leading anywhere. And it's very irritating to be reading this. So, we do not actually, this is not even a scene, right? Because it doesn't even fulfill the basic definition of a scene. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to remove this as well. Now let's just read this and try to kind of, create the scene further or maybe change something. Now, I do understand that making changes to this is going to heavily depend on what comes before and what comes after it. But here, let's just go with the flow and let's just kind of try to create a little bit of a story in a scene. Okay. So Arav sat on the edge of his bed, staring at his phone as the screen dimmed and lit up again. He had been meaning to call Mira all day, but every time he picked up the phone, something stopped him. Now, this much is actually pretty good because it's giving you at least an element of curiosity. What happened, right? He checked his phone. Now, before we do this, and I'm just kind of just going with my intuition here because although I'm reading from my notes, I'm not actually following the revised version that I had earlier revised because right now, okay, I do it in the moment, okay? I do this the entire day, so it's quite literally what I do, edit. So he opens, what do you call it when you open the dial pad or whatever. So he opens her contact and presses call, okay? Now, at least we have some movement. With this single sentence, we are turning it from passive to active. Okay. Now, if you want to keep the pacing extremely tight, what you can do is one ring, two rings, no answer. Okay. Now, this is how you keep. But you know what? When you write like this, the problem is nowadays GPT prose is very much like this. So don't go for it. Anyway, unless this is a very high tension or very high stakes scene, which it is clearly not, because earlier they were taking a lot of time just describing the cars in the street. So don't do it. Okay. So this is one way of doing it as I was showing you. We are not going to do it. He opens his contact and presses call. Okay. Now, here you can take your time and write. He waits for her to pick up, but there is no answer. Okay. He tries again, but again, no answer. And then it dawns on him. Maybe she has blocked him or something. I don't know exactly what happens when you call someone if they've blocked you. I think it just continuously sound as if the phone is busy. So maybe we can use that here. He waits for her to pick up, but at first, there is no answer. He tries again, and then her phone is busy. Okay, now we can add a little tension here. He tries a third time, and it is still busy. And then, okay, too much and. Then it dawns on him. Maybe now she had the not because earlier it was maybe she had already. Now she has just blocked him. Okay, so she saw his call. Basically, it is deliberate blocking now. Okay, so she saw his name and then she blocked it the way we do with the scammers. Okay, so then it dawns on him. Maybe she has blocked him, or maybe she blocked him. She just blocked him, whatever, however your writing style is, okay? Maybe she blocked him. Now we won't need this. Now we come to the point. He exhaled slowly and sat back down on the bed, placing the phone beside him this time. Maybe he could call her later. Now this goes out of the bane, out in the bane, and we are going to add something very interesting here. He exhaled slowly and sat back down on the bed, placing the phone beside him this time. Maybe he's wondering, did she really block him? Right? And we can even go in with, we'll have to change a line here. He picks up his phone and tries again. But before it could dial completely or whatever, before it could ring or give a busy beep, he cut it immediately. Now there's a lot of subtext here. I'll just tell you about it in a second. He picks up his phone, tries again, but before it could ring or give a busy beep, he cut it immediately. He did not want to. He already took a deep breath, right? Already. So that has been done. Maybe, he lays back down and maybe a small drop of tear falls on his cheek or on the pillow or something like that, just showing that there is more going on here that we are being told. Okay. Now, if you read this, it won't sound passive. Second, here is definite momentum because the girl, whoever she is, like Mira, has blocked him. Now, it could be that she blocked him, or it could be that he's assuming that she's blocked him. So, see, there's so much that can be gleaned out of this, right? Now, this is how your scenes should be. Again, now, this is not what I would call as a scene in itself. This is more like a transitioning into a scene. So, if this is a part of a manuscript, then the next scene, if I'm editing this and I come across a scene like this, I would actually merge it with the next scene and bring it up a little up and make this an entire scene that would make more sense. Okay. So this is how it's done. Now, again, it completely depends on what happens after this. Maybe, maybe if he would have just given that last call that he actually cut before the call could be connected. Maybe very big thing depends on that. Maybe Mira had an accident in that second and maybe, she needed call for help, and if he would have just called again, she would have picked up and told him, I need help, or something like that. So many things, so many possibilities. That's why this would depend on entirely on how the next part of the story is going to unfold. Now, coming to scene B. He adjusted the cuff of his shirt as he stood near the balcony, the low hum of conversation behind him blending into a distant blur. The city lights stretched endlessly below, flickering like something alive, something watching. Inside, the party was in full swing. Laughter rose and fell in waves. Glasses clinked. Music threaded through the air with a practiced ease. Everything felt exactly as it should. Perfect. He picked up his drink, swirling it absent-mindedly before taking a slow sip. The bitterness lingered, sharp and familiar. You always disappear at your own parties. Kabir didn't turn immediately. He knew that voice. Ananya stepped beside him, her presence quiet but steady, as though she had always been there, waiting for him to notice. I needed some air, he said. She smiled faintly. You've needed air for years. That landed. He let out a soft breath, his gaze still fixed on the skyline. You ever feel like all of this is just noise? He asked after a moment. Ananya tilted her head slightly. Only when I'm pretending it means something. Kabir laughed a quiet laugh at that, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The music swelled behind them. Inside, someone called Kabir's name. He didn't respond. Now, can you guys tell me how does this scene make you feel? Or maybe, what is wrong with this scene? Or maybe what is good in this scene and what is working in this scene? Please try. I'll give you all 2 minutes, okay? I'm just drinking water. Please put it in the chat. Come on. Asfa, Arya, Indrila, Saurabh. I would love to know what you all feel. Yes, the tone is calm and it's actually very interesting. Even I find it very interesting. It's actually pretty good scene. What do the others think? Works in terms of atmosphere. Yes, it has very good atmosphere. Yes, I agree. This scene is actually quite good. But there is a problem. Can you please tell me? Can you please try to guess what the problem could be? There is movement, there is little movement. We'll have to work on it. But pacing is there, yes? Okay. If you're meaning movement in terms of pacing is actually pretty good in this scene. Do things change in this scene? So again, we are going to ask ourselves the question, what changes at the end of the scene as opposed to the beginning of the scene? Nothing. And that is the problem with this scene. Nothing changes. Again, we get information. The information actually feels very interesting because it is presented in a very good way. The atmosphere is very well done in this scene. The pacing of this scene is very good. But the problem is when we ask ourselves what changed in this scene, nothing. The scene is actually static. So again, even though this is a well-written scene, it can be a part of a scene where something shifts, but it cannot be a scene in and as of itself, okay? Because if this has to be, yes, the ending is implying that something is about to change, but nothing has actually changed. That is why this is not a complete scene, okay? Now, let's try and make this into a scene that actually has good momentum, good shift in it, okay? Remember, no matter how good the scene is, if there is no shift, the purpose, it doesn't serve its purpose. So it's kind of useless. So all this good prose will be useless then. We don't want to do that, right? So what we are going to do is try and turn this into a good scene. Now, we are going to keep the prose because the prose here is actually pretty good. Okay, he picked up his drink. This is good. You always disappear at your own parties. This is very good. I'm going to remove this because I really do not want to play around with the spatial things right now. But I'm going to remove this. He knew that voice. Okay, and we are going to remove this to increase the pacing a little bit because I'm going to be adding some more elements after this. Okay, mostly remember when you're working with dialogues, even though if what was written here felt good, it was actually hindering the pace of the dialogues because when you're having conversation, try to have very less exposition between dialogues unless your character asks for it. Okay, so you can have exposition before the dialogue, you can have exposition after the dialogue, but not during the dialogue unless it is really required or unless you really feel that it sits well. Okay, he knew that voice, and I'm going to shift it here because it's by the same person. This is by Arav, right? No, Kabir, by Kabir. He knew that voice. I needed some air, he said. She smiled faintly. We actually don't need this. You've needed air for years. Now that language, see, I do not recommend writing sentences, complete sentences in 1, 2, 3 words unless you're doing it for the pacing. Okay, and we do not need a quick pace here. So we are going to remove. And in order to show that it landed, what we are going to do is he let out a soft breath and his gaze. Now, here the gaze was still fixed on the skyline because nothing was shifting in the scene. Here we need to show a shift. So I'm going to change things here. And his gaze met hers. Okay, you ever feel like all of this is just noise? Now I do not want this because this is bordering on a philosophical conversation. Now unless we are very sure that the next thing that's going to come up is going to be of a philosophical nature, or if this is a philosophical book, or maybe belonging to an adjacent genre, we do not want to be having this kind of conversation because it is just killing time of the reader. Okay, what I'm going to do is, now I'll provide you context first. What I am imagining right now is that Kabir and Ananya are a couple. They're separated. Okay, and the tension that you're feeling here, because when Kabir says, now I'm just making sure that we all are on the same page. Okay, you might have gleaned it already, you might not have, but I'm just trying to make sure that we all are on the same page. When Kabir says this, what it actually means is he's trying to avoid talking about something. That's why he's just talking about something very random. And Ananya is also doing the same thing. So they're trying to walk around a topic. So what we are going to do is we are going to try and turn that on its head and have at least one of them. And now, because Kabir is standing outside leaving his own party, we are going to have Ananya do it for him. Okay? So we are going to have Ananya say here, we're going to have her say, I'm removing Kabir's dialogue. When are you planning on telling everyone? Okay, now just bear with me for a second. You'll understand where I'm taking the scene. Ananya tilted her head slightly. When are you planning on telling everyone? Now, see, the tone has changed entirely, okay? Kabir huffed a quiet. Now, obviously, this is not going to make sense because it was for the earlier dialogue. Audibly or loudly or whatever suits you, yeah? Kabir exhaled audibly. This is not the right place, Ananya. Yeah, whatever spelling is, okay, sorry. I have a habit of talking when I'm writing for everything. Okay, so Kabir exhaled audibly. This is not the right place, Ananya. Again, I can add one more detail here. She could see the twitch. Now, because she is his wife, she's going to notice the small things, right? His tells, basically. She could see the small twitch in his neck. Now, if I would have made it lips, it would have been like a ghost of a smile. It is not what it is. She could see the small twitch in his neck, the nerve, right? For a moment, neither of them spoke. The music swelled behind them. Inside, someone called Kabir's name. He didn't respond. Why? Because earlier he was engrossed in a conversation with Ananya. Right now, he's going to try and avoid her. But I'm going to add another dialogue here so that it makes more sense when we end it the way we are going to end it. She could see the small twitch in his neck, or whatever, whatever you want to call it, in his neck. It is never the right place or the right time. I'm done waiting, Kabir. See, so maybe now it could be interpreted anyway. There could be a couple who are going through a separation and she's asking him, when are you going to tell everyone about our separation? Or maybe it could be a second wife or something like that, and she's waiting for him to announce their relationship to everyone. Anything can be the case, right? It depends again on what scene was there before this scene and what comes after this scene. But in this scene right now with these changes, see how it changes. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The music swelled behind them. Inside, someone called Kabir's name. This time, he responded because earlier he hadn't responded to Ananya, right? So he responded because he wants to avoid this conversation with Ananya. Now, does it make sense? Let's read it again from here. He knew that voice. I needed some air, he said. She smiled. You've needed air for years. Now, because she's pissed with him here, we can't have her smile like that. She rolled her eyes, would be much appropriate, according to the dialogues. Or maybe, she stiffened because she doesn't like that reply. She stiffened slightly. You've needed air for years. He let out a soft breath, and his gaze met hers. Ananya tilted her head slightly. When are you planning on telling everyone? Kabir exhaled audibly. This is not the right place, Ananya. She could see the small twitch in his neck. It is never the right place or the right time. I'm done waiting, Kabir. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The music swelled behind them. Inside, someone called Kabir's name. This time, he responded. See, so here what is happening is earlier we were getting some vague information. Here we are getting at least some solid information about the tension building between both of them. Okay, this is how I would do this. Now, obviously, again, it depends on what comes next, what the story is, but this is how you diagnose problems and this is how you try to solve them. Again, what I did here is on a sentence level. Why? Because I really wanted to show you guys how it is done. If this was a revision, I would have been doing a revision. What I would have done is I would have made a note of it that this is not making sense. For this, I will go to the next scene and see if I can bring up something here, maybe reveal some information a bit earlier, maybe reveal some information a bit later, maybe, make slight changes that would make sure that all my scenes are flowing well and also they are all making sense. Now, again, remember, in a story, always a scene, a chapter, or anything should always take the story forward. It should either reveal something about the character or the plot, or it must give information to the reader about something related to the story or the plot. Again, okay, if these purposes are not fulfilled by, say, a scene, or say a micro event, or say a micro scene, or say a full chapter, it needs to go out. It doesn't matter how well it is written. Okay. So now I'm going to tell you one very important thing before we end today's session. Okay, I'm going to go a little bit quickly because I have a meeting at 7. Okay, what we are going to do is now the problem is I cannot put up a full chapter here and help you revise it because you wouldn't want to do that. So the way we tackle the scene, the same way we are going to tackle a chapter. When we read a chapter, we are going to stop after every single chapter and question, ask the 5 questions that I just gave you. Does it make sense? What is it doing? What is changing? What is the resistance? So what's basically the conflict? And how are things ending up and how they are different from the way they began? Okay, so these are the questions that we are going to be asking ourselves after each and every single chapter. So even every chapter should answer these questions. If it does not, then that means you need to work on it. If you get the answer to all the 5 questions for scenes and chapters, that means your chapter or scene is good and it's doing its job. Okay, so you can move on to the next one. This is how we do revision. Now, I've also prepared, and this is just going to take us 10 minutes, how to build a revision plan. So now you've done something most writers never do. You've actually taken a pause and looked at your work with clarity. Once you do that, then you would have done that. But here's where a lot of people still can go wrong. They see the problems and then they try to fix everything at once. And that's not what we are going to do. So, what most writers do is they jump between chapters, they rewrite random scenes, and they start editing language again. And within a few days, they're right back at it. And then they will say, I don't know what I'm doing anymore. And then again, they'll feel overwhelmed and they'll stop. We do not want to get overwhelmed, okay? So, what we are going to do now is very important. We are going to take everything you've just seen and turn it into a very clear, structured revision plan, because insight without direction is useless. So, step 1 is going to be identify your top 3 problems. Now, when you read your manuscript the first time, you have noted down all the scene related problems. When you read the manuscript the second time, you've written down all the chapter related problems. Or you can go about it in a different way. You can give the manuscript one read, note down all the scene related problems, work on them, and then read the manuscript the second time, note down all the chapter related problems, and then work on them. That is one way of doing it. The other would be identify the top 3 problems. Okay, I don't want 10 problems, I don't want a full list of problems, because when you begin revising, you need to keep your goals so that you are able to achieve them. Okay, just 3. Look at your manuscript and ask, what are the 3 biggest things that are not working right now? For example, maybe you have a weak protagonist, maybe the scenes are repetitive, maybe there's no clear escalation, intention, or pacing, or maybe there's structural confusion. Keep it simple, but be very honest with yourself, because if everything feels like a problem, you haven't prioritized anything then. Okay. Step number 2, categorize those problems. Every problem you've identified will fall into one of the 4 layers. Actually, 5 layers that we've seen, but they can actually fall into these: structural, character, scene level, or language. This step is important because it tells you what kind of work you are actually dealing with, because fixing a structural problem is very different from fixing a language problem. And if you confuse the two, you will waste a lot of time. Step number 3, prioritize the order. Now, this is where most writers make mistakes. They fix what is easiest first, not what is important. So, let me give you the order and I want you to stick to this. Please make a note of it. You always revise in this sequence: character, structure, then scenes, then language. Story, character, structure, scenes, language. Not the other way around, never the other way around. Because if you start with language, you're polishing something that may not even survive the revisions. So it's going to be pointless. Now, step number 4 would be execution method. Now, let's make this very practical. How do you actually do this? Very simple. You move through your manuscript in a structured way. You work first on the scenes, second on the chapter, and then on the overall manuscript. As I said, you will be needing at least 2 readings of your manuscript. If you're smart about it, try to keep all the 5 layers in your mind and work on them first scene by scene in the first reading and then chapter by chapter in the second reading. After that, you can again give a third reading and you will see for yourself how good your book would be then. So first you fix a scene, then you check how it fits into the chapter, then you check how that chapter contributes to the larger story. And then you move forward. What you do not do is jump between random sections. Fix one scene in chapter 2, then one scene in chapter 15. Never do that. Rewrite something just because it feels off. Don't do that. First, identify the problem. Otherwise, it will create chaos. Remember, revision needs consistency, it needs direction and discipline. Because this is the difference between someone who keeps
Thank you for attending workshop number
someone
1
who keeps
of the
working on a
Verbatik Media
manuscript for
Revision
years and
Workshop
someone who
series.
actually
I hope this
finishes
session
revising
helped
it.
you look at
So
revision not
remember,
as
this
random
is your anchor
rewriting
for the
but
entire
as a
process.
structured
Fix the
diagnostic
right
process.
things in the right
If you
order.
enjoyed this
Working
workshop,
faster
please
would
consider
not get
subscribing to the
you
channel,
anywhere. And
sharing
once
the
you start
session with
working
fellow
like this,
writers, and
revision
leaving your
stops
thoughts or questions in
feeling
the comments below.
overwhelming
If you would
and it
like
will feel
professional feedback on your own
controlled.
manuscript, you
And
can
that's when
explore
you'll
our
be able to
manuscript
finish them.
assessment and editing
And this is
services through
how
the
you
links in the
revise
description.
your
You can also
manuscript.
join our
Okay?
writing community for
So, with this,
exercises,
we are
resources,
at an
future
end
workshops, and
of our
revision
first
discussions.
workshop.
Thank you once again for being here, and I'll see you in the next workshop.